Hi, again, it's Dr. Scott French for the Way, the Truth, and the Life with Father Tom Dowling. And we're going to talk today about what is a near-death experience. In our introduction, we spoke about how we're going to link the near-death experiences, Big Bang Theory, Shroud of Turin, and 21st century Eucharistic miracles with both science and what we read in the Bible and proclaimed by the Catholic Church. So near-death experiences, as we said in our introduction, is evidence that our soul survives bodily death. And there was a study done looking at all the studies of near-death experiences in 2022 by the New York Academy of Sciences, and they proclaimed at the end of that the evidence is overwhelming that your consciousness, they're not going to call it your soul, survives bodily death. So what is a near-death experience? A near-death experience is someone who, as an ER doctor myself, you're doing CPR on somebody. If you did an EEG, their brain would be flatlined, so it's what we call clinical death. There may be some sputtering of the neurons in the midbrain to give respiration or whatever, but basically their brain activity is done. It's not functioning, their heart's not functioning, they're not getting oxygenation to the brain. And these people experience out-of-body experiences. They see and hear, they see their body being worked on, and in a lot of cases, these are people blind from birth, so no neurons that have any visual information, and they see and they hear. So we as doctors have learned that we got to be careful what we say when we're resuscitating somebody because they can remember and yet they were clinically dead. And so there are so many of these stories. In fact, again, back to that 2022 study by the New York Academy of Science looking at all the studies, and there's been many others in many books and many studies. It looks like children, about 65% of children who have a near-death experience, who have clinical death, have a near-death experience. About 18% of adults have a near-death experience, and again, some that are blind from birth have near-death experiences. And so in each of these cases, they describe things that happened while they're clinically dead. And in a lot of cases, they're floating through hospital walls, they're floating outside the hospital walls, and they see things. One case of a person blind from birth floats outside the walls and sees a train on the tracks and sees the snow and sees the sign where it's going. And this is while he's in the hospital, clinically dead, and has no neurons in his brain. So there's no naturalistic explanation for that. It means that the soul, that life-giving principle, and our intellect and will doesn't come from the natural world, and so it doesn't follow the natural world laws. So entropy of decaying. Our bodies die, but our soul doesn't. We do have an immortal soul. And then children, they meet dead relatives, and again they see things. They all have two things in common. People with near-death experiences have two things in common. Number one, they don't want to come back because it's better on the other side. And number two, they lose their fear of death because, again, there's something better on the other side. Again, showing that there is this immortal soul, that we have this immortal soul. And basically the Bible talks about that too, because remember in John 1, we hear that nothing was made that was made without Jesus, basically, without the second person of the Trinity. And then there are estimates about 15 to 20% of what we call negative near-death experiences. So most people have particularly 100% of children actually have a positive near-death experience, but 15 to 20% of adults, it looks like, don't have a positive, they have a negative near-death experience. For example, there were ISIS fighters found on the battlefield for dead, again, clinically dead, but were resuscitated, and they had visions of hell, and then they converted to Christianity. So, and that relates again back to the Bible. Remember when Jesus is talking about Judas, remember Jesus says, it had been better if he'd not been born. which means that when you die, despite what the world tells us, that you go into nothingness, that's not the case. You actually go to one destination or the other, and that's what near-death experiences demonstrate. So, Father Tom.
Yeah, it's appropriate. We're starting this in 2025. It's the 50th anniversary of Raymond Moody's bestseller,
Yes.
1975,
Yeah.
Life After Life,
Yes.
which got me started personally. I turned my life around and I said, my God, this is incredible. And he backed it up. As you were talking about examples of people being outside the hospital, I was thinking of the woman who was brought into the hospital and did code. She had been in a car accident. She was in her late 20s, but she had 2 young children, and she, of course, had the experience, a very good experience, and part of her didn't want to leave, and she said, no, I've got to go back to my girls, and which were like 3 and 4 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just shows you the power
Yeah.
of this union with the divine. And we can get, and what's exciting about this is right behind us through adoration, and particularly through adoration where we can actually see the host and the monsters. So benediction, let's be blunt, benediction needs to be really restored, because that adoration, leaving it there, and people coming in, all of us coming in and adoring it. It's amazing what level of mysticism we can reach if we want to. And of course it takes time, and there are distractions. I always like to use, but this is a practical thing, but Father Thomas Keating, who has passed away in his 90s, the famous Trappist monk who started the centering prayer movement, the technique is to use one sacred word to get you back on track. Because let's face it, if you're going to be a couple of hours in the church adoring the Blessed Sacrament, there are distractions. It's just the way we're made. And that centering prayer, I find, is a real good technique to get us back. So obviously it would be something to do with the Blessed Sacrament, or a saint, or the Blessed Virgin. I find the Blessed Virgin, you just say, through Mary, we come to you, O Lord. That's the, Ad Jesum per Mariam, that's the way. That really does the trick. But one word, let's keep it simple. And this adoration will bring us to a point, like the ancient Celtic monks used to say, to get to a place where the ocean is our desert, because they were based, of course, on the ancient Egyptian monks in the desert in Africa, Sahara Desert, and they found their spirituality through that. And it was very, very rigorous, but it got to a point where they were in union with the divine. They were in union with the divine, and they lived in some very, very tough places. We just celebrated earlier this month, of course, the feast of St. Anthony of the Desert. Supposedly he lived to be 105 and ate locusts, and I guess that was good for his digestive system. But he was a start of that incredible monastic movement, and we have such incredible things, like you just mentioned, Scott, about the ISIS fighters, and then coming through a terrible experience and then converting to Christianity. I mean, we had recently the presence of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia going to a Coptic Catholic Mass in Cairo, Egypt, and sitting there. Now, he didn't go to the sacrament, obviously, but he was there. It shows you what can happen if we start believing in the presence of Christ among us, and in the Eucharist. So important to adore him through the Eucharist. So it's an exciting time, because, as you said, millions of people have experienced the near death now.
Yeah,
and they know that the consciousness, and the scientific magazines, by the way, which I noticed that on the internet. I haven't picked up too many of them, to be honest, but they're pushing the fact that consciousness is outside the body. They don't get into the religious aspect of it, but they do get into the purely scientific part. So we're on a cusp of belief and union, the belief system of the spiritual and the union with science. we're just beginning this incredible journey, and I'm so happy that we're starting it. We're starting part of it is through our little series here now.
Yeah, it's a great time to be alive because the Holy Spirit is very active right now. In the 21st century, we've come through a lot in the last few years, in the last few decades, and the Holy Spirit is very active to show us that you couldn't have science without a knowable, understandable world, and all the natural laws were set and created by God with the Big Bang. We'll get into that in another segment. But also, science will affirm that there's no scientific explanation for it. So it's what we call supernatural, metaphysical, there's no naturalistic
What's
explanation.
the medical term for when they can't explain it? Doctors use they use kind of a...
Well, yeah, we say there's no naturalistic explanation.
Okay.
No naturalistic explanation, no scientific explanation for it. It's outside of what we see, the natural laws. So the other aspect of showing that life exists outside of the material world, is what we call terminal lucidity. And terminal lucidity are those people who, say, for example, have severe Alzheimer's or dementia for years and years, and suddenly the day they die or day before they die, they suddenly wake up and say, hey, I'm dying, we got to do this with the house and this, that, and then they die. So again, these people haven't been able to speak or whatever, and they suddenly have this terminal lucidity. That's also very common. A lot of people have had looked at studies of that, and there's a lot of people who have had that as well. Again, showing that consciousness does not come from the material world. And so we'll talk about that as well as the connection with Eucharistic miracles in our next segment.